If you made it to this video, I want you to know something important from the very beginning. This was not an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't God overlooking you. And it certainly wasn't a punishment for some spiritual failure you think you made. The pain you experienced in that relationship is not proof that you were far from God. Many times it's actually a sign that He was trying to wake you up. Maybe, quietly, you've already asked yourself some hard questions. Why did God allow this? If I was trying to do the right thing, why did I suffer so much? Was I weak, naive, or spiritually immature? These questions are not a sin. They come from a tired, confused, and wounded heart. And the Bible reminds us that nothing lived in secret stays hidden forever. Everything that hurts, confuses, and weighs on the soul eventually comes into the light, not to destroy us, but to set us free. Ellen White teaches that God is not the author of suffering, but that He allows trials for an educational purpose. He does not turn a blind eye to the pain of His children. On the contrary, He sees it with absolute clarity. When suffering enters the life of someone who is trying to do what is right, it never happens without a higher purpose. This is where many people get confused. They believe that if something went wrong, then God must have pulled away. But Scripture shows the opposite. There are moments when God is closer than ever, even when the path feels dark. A trial does not mean abandonment. It means something valuable is being shaped. Relationships have a deep power over the soul. They touch sensitive areas, expose expectations, reveal unmet needs, and test what we believe about love, faith, and self-worth. That's why it's not strange that God allows major lessons to happen in this very area. Ellen White reminds us that character is revealed in the hardest circumstances, not in seasons of comfort. If that relationship drained your peace, confused your mind, and made you question who you were, it didn't happen to shrink you. The truth goes deeper, and it may feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also freeing. God did not allow this to punish you, but to awaken you. You were not weak for loving. You were not foolish for trying to make it work. You were not less spiritual for suffering. Often, those who carry strong principles, empathy, and a high level of awareness end up getting hurt precisely because they haven't yet learned that kindness without discernment can become an unbearable burden. Throughout this video, and throughout this entire playlist, we will walk together to answer, based on the Bible and the writings of Ellen White, the question that changes everything. What was God trying to reveal by allowing this relationship? Don't rush this answer. It needs to move from the mind to the heart. And if, as you listen, something begins to make sense, not as accusation, but as clarity, that is already a sign that the light is beginning to come in. If you'd like, you can use the comments as a quiet space for reflection. Not to expose yourself, but to mark an inner decision. Sometimes, writing is the first step toward a spiritual awakening. One of the greatest spiritual distortions that often appears after an abusive relationship is the quiet idea that God was punishing you. That belief does not come from the Bible. It comes from pain that was never properly understood. When suffering doesn't find a spiritual explanation, it turns into guilt. And that is what truly weakens faith. Ellen White makes it clear throughout her writings that God is not the author of evil. In The Great Controversy, she explains that human suffering takes place within a larger context, the conflict between good and evil, where God allows certain trials not to destroy His children, but to reveal choices, strengthen character, and expose deceptions that would otherwise remain hidden. This distinction is essential. God allowing something is not the same as God desiring it. Many things He allows do not reflect His ideal, but they reveal His patience in leading human beings to the truth. If God prevented all pain, many illusions would never be broken. Many mistakes would continue to be called love. Many emotional prisons would still be confused with faithfulness. In education, Ellen White explains that trials are teaching tools, capable of developing discernment and spiritual maturity when they are rightly understood. The problem is that when someone goes through a relationship marked by control, confusion, and emotional exhaustion, the experience is usually interpreted only through feelings, and wounded feelings rarely see the whole picture. The Bible shows that even faithful people went through deeply painful experiences that were not punishment, but preparation. Suffering by itself is not a sign of God's disapproval. Often, it reveals that something needed to be seen, corrected, or brought to an end. God does not educate his children through cruelty, but he also does not shield them from the truth when it must be revealed. Relationships have a unique power to expose us. They reach places pride cannot protect, where religious language no longer holds up, where the appearance of strength collapses. In Steps to Christ, Ellen White explains that God allows the human heart to be tested so that true dependence on him can be restored, not to humiliate us, but to free us from false supports. When a relationship begins to steal your peace, confuse your conscience, and demand compromises that violate your principles, that is not a sign that God has stepped away. On the contrary, it is often the moment when he is trying to get your attention more urgently. Pain becomes a language when other ways no longer work. This completely changes the question you may have been asking all along. Instead of, "Why did God do this to me?" as the question becomes, "What was God trying to show me while this was happening?" That shift does not bring guilt. It brings clarity. It does not bring condemnation. It brings direction. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White warns that ignoring warning signs can unnecessarily prolong suffering. God speaks in many ways, through his word, through conscience, through the loss of peace, and in some cases, through painful experience itself. Not because he delights in pain, but because he cares too much to allow his children to remain trapped in deceptions that pull them away from him. Understanding this is the first step out of spiritual confusion. When you realize that the trial was not a punishment but a call to clarity, something begins to realign within you. The pain may still be there, but it no longer carries the weight of guilt. And that prepares the ground for something even deeper. Understanding that behind many draining relationships, there is a real, silent, and strategic spiritual conflict. That is exactly what we need to talk about next. To fully understand why this relationship was so draining, it's necessary to see something that is rarely taught clearly. Human relationships are also part of the great spiritual conflict. This is not about seeing people as enemies, but about recognizing that the enemy works precisely where the soul is most vulnerable. In The Great Controversy, Ellen White explains that Satan operates most intensely in areas where he can confuse the mind, weaken faith, and distort character. And few areas are as sensitive as emotional bonds. That is where decisions are made not only with reason, but with the heart. And when the heart is wounded, discernment becomes fragile. This is why relationships marked by control, emotional instability, and constant blame shifting create a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond emotions. They reach the conscience. Little by little, a person begins to doubt what they feel, what they think, and even what they believe. Peace withdraws, clarity fades, and faith is lived in survival mode. Ellen White notes in Mind, Character, and Personality that one of the enemy's goals is to produce moral confusion, to make what is right seem extreme and what is wrong seem acceptable. When this happens within a relationship, the conflict stops being merely external and begins to take place within the soul itself. The person is no longer fighting just to maintain the relationship, but to preserve their own identity. This is one of the reasons abusive relationships cause such deep spiritual exhaustion. It's not only about what is said or done, it's about the invisible environment that forms, an environment where truth must constantly be explained, where boundaries are treated as selfishness, and where conscience is pressured to remain silent in the name of peace. But that peace does not come from God. The Bible teaches that God is not a God of confusion, but of order. When a relationship becomes a constant space of instability, fear, and self-doubt, something is out of divine alignment. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White warns that Satan takes advantage of poorly guided relationships to weaken spiritual life, shifting attention away from communion with God toward the constant management of human conflict. This explains why many people, even while praying, reading the Bible, and trying to do good, feel their spirituality begin to dry up within this kind of bond. It is not a lack of faith. It is spiritual exhaustion. The energy that should be used to grow, serve, and be strengthened in God is slowly consumed by the effort to stay balanced in an environment that never stabilizes. Another important point is that the enemy does not need to destroy faith directly. Often he simply wears it down over time. Ellen White writes in Steps to Christ that Satan prefers to work subtly, gradually weakening trust in God and in oneself. Confusing relationships provide fertile ground for this kind of silent attack. For this reason, understanding the great conflict within relationships is not spiritual exaggeration, it is clarity. It means recognizing that not every bond that begins with affection ends in growth, and that true love will never require you to live in a constant state of inner tension. This understanding leads us to an unavoidable question. Why do people who seek to live by higher principles seem to suffer more in these kinds of relationships? The answer is directly connected to character, and that is exactly what we need to look at next. There is a quiet question many people ask after living through an abusive relationship. If I tried to do what was right, why was I hurt so deeply? The answer is often not found in weakness of character, but in quite the opposite. People who value principles, empathy, and a strong moral conscience can become easy targets when they have not yet learned how to protect those virtues with discernment. Ellen White explains in Testimonies for the Church that those who seek to live by higher principles will inevitably face opposition. The enemy is not interested in those already living in moral confusion. His focus is on those who want to do what is right, but are still learning how to combine kindness with firmness. Virtue, when unguarded, can be exploited. Christian kindness is not naivety, but it is also not passivity. In Mind, Character, and Personality, Ellen White notes that traits such as sensitivity, a sacrificial spirit, and a desire to please can be distorted when they are not balanced by reason and an enlightened conscience. The result is that what was meant to build up begins to wear a person down. This is why in many abusive relationships, the one who suffers most is often the one who shows more patience, more willingness to understand, and more openness to dialogue, not because they lack value, but because they carry virtues that have not yet learned how to say enough. The enemy does not create these qualities, he simply tries to use them out of place. In education, Ellen White teaches that character is formed when principles are put into practice under pressure. A trial does not only expose the other person's wrongs, it also reveals where our own virtues need to mature. Love without clear boundaries turns into a burden. Loyalty without discernment becomes a prison. Forgiveness without real change becomes a cycle of repeated harm. This does not mean the person was wrong for loving. It means they were still learning how to love safely. Christ himself showed deep compassion, yet he never allowed that compassion to be used to manipulate him. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White describes how Jesus discerned intentions and did not place himself under anyone's emotional control, even when approached by those who seem sincere. When Christian character is not yet fully mature, it can become a target for unbalanced relationships, not because God has withdrawn, but because there were still important lessons to be learned. God does not remove virtues, he refines them, and often that refinement happens when we are faced with situations that show us that kindness also needs boundaries. Perhaps you were called too sensitive, too demanding, or hard to please. But in the light of truth, this often means only that your conscience was not willing to be silenced. In Steps to Christ, Ellen White explains that the Holy Spirit works by awakening the conscience, even when that brings temporary discomfort. In this case, discomfort is not a sign of error. It is a sign of spiritual life. Understanding that Christian character can become a target completely changes the narrative. You were not chosen to suffer because you were weak, but because you carried values that needed to be protected, strengthened, and aligned with wisdom. And it is exactly at this point that an essential warning appears. When kindness goes beyond the limits of wisdom, it stops building and begins to harm. That limit, so often ignored yet so necessary, is what we need to talk about now. There is a delicate point in the Christian life that is rarely taught with clarity. Not all suffering that is endured is virtue, and not all staying is faithfulness. Many people remain in abusive relationships not because of a lack of faith, but because of a distorted understanding of what it means to love according to God's heart. Ellen White warns in Testimonies for the Church that true sacrifice never requires the violation of conscience or the destruction of personal dignity. God does not ask his children to remain in environments where the mind is constantly oppressed, peace is taken away, and truth has to be negotiated just to maintain an appearance of harmony. The problem begins when Christian kindness stops being guided by wisdom. In Mind, Character and Personality, Ellen White explains that many confuse patience with permission and long-suffering with tolerance of ongoing wrong. When that happens, the soul begins to carry burdens that God never placed upon it. This is when dangerous thoughts start to settle in the heart. If I love more, this will change. If I am more patient, God will act. If I keep insisting, this proves my faithfulness. But faithfulness to God never requires the erasure of self. In Steps to Christ, Ellen White makes it clear that divine love always leads to freedom and restoration, never to emotional captivity or a constant sense of guilt. When love begins to demand the silence of conscience, something has already moved out of spiritual alignment. Many abusive relationships are sustained by this very imbalance. The kind-hearted person begins to adapt to discomfort. Small concessions are made. Boundaries that were once clear start to blur. And without realizing it, what was once unacceptable becomes manageable. Not because it became right, but because the soul grew tired of resisting. Ellen White notes in Education that the danger is not only in committing conscious wrongs, but in becoming accustomed to them. What is repeatedly tolerated reshapes moral perception. The heart adjusts to pain, and the absence of peace begins to feel normal. But normal without peace never comes from God. One of the clearest signs that kindness has crossed the line into a lack of wisdom is the gradual loss of peace. The person still prays, still reads the Bible, still wants to do good, but carries a constant weight in the spirit. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White writes that inner peace is one of the greatest indicators of God's presence and guidance. When it is persistently absent, it should not be ignored. God does not call us into relationships where the soul lives in a constant state of alert. He does not ask his children to emotionally survive. He calls us to abundant life, to balanced growth, to relationships that strengthen rather than drain. When kindness stops building and begins to wound, it is not a sign of greater love but of weaker discernment, something that still needs to be developed. Recognizing this limit does not bring condemnation. It brings clarity. It brings the understanding that God is not pleased with sacrifices that destroy, but with obedience that sets free. And often, before any external change happens, God begins a quiet work within us, revealing what needs to be healed, strengthened, and realigned. It is exactly this inner revelation, often uncomfortable but deeply necessary, that God starts to bring about when he allows certain relationships to expose us beyond what we thought we could endure. And that is what we need to talk about next. What God was trying to reveal within you during this process. When God allows an experience to go beyond our emotional limits, it is rarely meant to break us. Its purpose is to reveal what still needs healing, strengthening, and maturity. God's focus is not only on what the other person did, but on what that experience brought to the surface within us. Ellen White explains in Education that trials reveal traits of character that remain hidden during times of ease. Not because those traits are shameful, but because they have not yet been fully addressed. God does not expose in order to humiliate. He reveals in order to restore. What surfaces during pain is often what needs to be reached by grace. Abusive relationships often act like uncomfortable mirrors. They do not show who you truly are at your core, but they reveal old wounds that are still influencing your choices. In Steps to Christ, Ellen White explains that the human heart carries tendencies shaped over a lifetime and that only genuine communion with God can bring real healing to these deeper areas. Perhaps during that relationship, you noticed how much you depended on the other person's approval to feel secure, or how fear of rejection led you to tolerate things that violated your conscience. Maybe there was a constant anxiety to fix the relationship, as if your worth were tied to making it work. These patterns are not created there, they are simply activated there. In Mind, Character and Personality, Ellen White teaches that many emotional weaknesses are formed through unresolved past experiences, and that God, in his mercy, allows them to come into the light so they no longer govern life invisibly. Pain becomes an invitation to healing when it is understood in the light of truth. This completely changes how you view your own story. Instead of saying, "I ruined everything," the soul begins to understand, "God was showing me where I still needed to grow." Not to condemn, but to free. Not to diminish, but to realign. Inner revelation is not an attack on identity. It is a call to maturity. Another important point is that these wounds often hide beneath good intentions. Love, loyalty, the desire to please, and a sacrificial spirit can mask deep insecurities. Ellen White notes in Testimonies for the Church that the heart can deceive itself when intense feelings are mistaken for solid principles. God allows that deception to be confronted before it becomes a lasting pattern. When these areas begin to surface, the process can be painful. There may be shame, confusion, and resistance, but there is also the possibility of freedom. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White describes how Christ dealt with human weakness. He never ignored what needed correction, but he never exposed it without offering restoration. That is how God works with us. Notice this: God was not trying to show you that you were insufficient. He was revealing that you no longer needed to live from old wounds. What was activated by pain can now be treated by grace. The relationship did not create your vulnerabilities. It simply brought into the light what already needed care. And when this revelation happens, something begins to shift quietly within. The conscience awakens. Tolerance decreases. The need to please at any cost begins to lose its grip. A new way of seeing emerges, more attentive, more careful, more aligned with truth. This new way of seeing has a name in the Bible and in the writings of Ellen White: spiritual discernment. It is exactly this discernment, born not from fear, but from maturity, that we now need to understand. When the conscience awakens and wounds begin to be acknowledged, God leads a person into an essential step of Christian growth: spiritual discernment. Discernment is not about distrusting everyone, nor about becoming hard or emotionally closed. Discernment is learning to see clearly what was once interpreted only through emotion. Ellen White states in the Acts of the Apostles that spiritual maturity is shown in the ability to distinguish between what merely appears good and what truly comes from God. Many traps do not present themselves as obvious error, but as something almost right, almost healthy, almost loving. That is why discernment is not born out of haste, but out of experience illuminated by the Word. Jesus is the greatest example of this balance. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White describes how Christ loved deeply, yet never allowed himself to be ruled by the emotional pressure of others. He discerned intentions, perceived hidden motives, and knew when to move forward and when to step back. His love was never naive, and his compassion never cancelled his mission. This point is essential for anyone who has lived through an abusive relationship. Many people confuse discernment with judgment, but Ellen White explains in Steps to Christ that discerning is not about condemning the other person, it is about protecting one's own soul. God does not ask his children to close their eyes to what wounds the conscience in the name of a misunderstood spirituality. As discernment begins to take shape, a person starts noticing signs that were once ignored. Conversations that drain peace, actions that contradict words, promises that are never fulfilled, yet always demand more tolerance. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White warns that repeatedly ignoring these signs weakens spiritual sensitivity, leaving the mind increasingly confused. Discernment also teaches that love does not require unrestricted access. Jesus never granted intimacy without transformation. He offered grace, but he did not validate hypocrisy. In Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, Ellen White emphasizes that true spirituality lies in living out the truth with gentleness, without allowing it to be twisted to justify behaviors that draw a person away from God. This kind of maturity does not happen instantly. It develops as a person learns to listen to their conscience, now more sensitive to the voice of the Holy Spirit. What once felt like doubt begins to turn into conviction. What once was confusion begins to become clarity, and little by little a simple but decisive question emerges. It is no longer, how do I save this relationship? But, is this drawing me closer to God or pulling me away from Him? That question changes everything. In education, Ellen White teaches that the right choice is often not the most comfortable one, but it is the one that preserves the integrity of character. Discernment, therefore, is not only about knowing what to avoid, but about understanding what must be left behind for growth to continue. This is the point where many people realize that loving does not always mean staying, and that leaving is not the same as spiritual failure. On the contrary, at certain moments, faithfulness to God requires decisions that hurt, but ultimately bring freedom. And when this conviction begins to take shape, the next question presses even more strongly. If discernment is seeing clearly, what do we do when that clarity reveals that staying is no longer obedience? That is exactly the question that must now be faced. There comes a decisive moment in spiritual growth when all justifications begin to lose their strength. The emotions are still there, the attachment still weighs heavy, but something within the conscience becomes impossible to ignore. That is when the question that defines everything emerges. Is this drawing me closer to God or pulling me away from Him? This question is not born out of impulsiveness. It comes after discernment has been formed, after the soul has already tried to insist, explain, fix, and endure far more than it should, or than. In Steps to Christ, Ellen White explains that the Holy Spirit works by leading the mind toward truth gradually, until the moment arrives when the conscience can no longer tolerate self-deception. Many people remain in abusive relationships because they are asking the wrong questions. They ask whether they still love, whether they still feel something, whether there is still hope for change. But Ellen White warns in Education that feelings are not reliable guides when they are not aligned with principles. The spiritual standard has never been emotional intensity, but faithfulness to truth. When a relationship begins to pull a person away from sincere prayer, from peaceful time in the Word, and from inner peace, this does not happen by chance. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White explains that God often communicates by withdrawing peace when His children are about to cross dangerous boundaries. Persistent restlessness is not confusion. It is a warning. This is a hard truth to accept because it touches emotional attachment. Staying feels safer than facing loss. But in The Desire of Ages, Ellen White shows that Christ never sacrificed truth in order to preserve relationships. When communion with God was at stake, He chose obedience, even when it meant distance and misunderstanding. Answering the question, is this drawing me closer to God or pulling me away from Him, with honesty requires spiritual courage. Because when the answer becomes clear, responsibility becomes clear as well. A person begins to see that insisting is no longer love, it is resistance to God's call, and staying stops being faithfulness and starts being fear. This is where many try to negotiate with God. Just a little longer. Just one more try. Just one more conversation. But Ellen White writes in Testimonies for the Church that delaying clear decisions unnecessarily prolongs suffering and weakens spiritual sensitivity. God does not speak to confuse, He speaks to set free. When clarity arrives, it brings with it a different kind of pain. It is no longer the pain of confusion, but the pain of choice. Choosing obedience is almost never comfortable, but it always bears fruit. In Education, Ellen White teaches that every decision made in favor of truth strengthens character and expands the ability to discern rightly in the future. Perhaps you are not yet ready to take outward steps, and that is okay. But if this question has already begun to echo within you, something important has already happened. The veil has been lifted. The conscience has awakened. And even if the decision has not yet been made, the path is already becoming visible. Because when God leads someone into clarity, He never does so in order to abandon them afterward. He prepares each step, and what comes next is not condemnation, but direction. In the next stage of this process, it becomes necessary to understand something many prefer to avoid. There are moments when obedience requires separation. That is what we will need to address with honesty and care in the next videos of this series. By the time you reach this point, one thing needs to be very clear. Nothing you went through was in vain. Even if, for a long time, everything felt confusing, heavy, and unfair, God was never absent from this process. He was working quietly, patiently, and with deep intention. Ellen White writes in Education that God never wastes an experience when it is surrendered to him with sincerity. What seemed like nothing but pain was in fact shaping discernment. What felt like loss was preparing maturity, and what looked like delay was preventing even greater harm. You were not destroyed by that relationship. You were awakened to see boundaries, to listen to your conscience, to understand that true love never requires you to lose yourself so that someone else can remain. 10 Steps to Christ, Ellen White affirms that God's work in the human heart always leads to freedom, never to emotional or spiritual bondage. You may still be dealing with mixed emotions. Part of you understands the truth, while another part still feels the weight of attachment, guilt, or doubt. That does not invalidate what God is doing. In Testimonies for the Church, Ellen White reminds us that spiritual growth is rarely linear. It happens in layers, as the mind and heart gradually align with truth. What matters most right now is not rushing decisions, but honoring the clarity you have already received. When God begins to shine light on an area of life, ignoring that light only prolongs pain, but walking with it, even slowly, always leads to peace. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White shows that Jesus never forced decisions, but he also never hid the truth to preserve temporary comfort. This video was not meant to solve everything at once. It was meant to open your eyes, to move you out of guilt and into spiritual understanding, to show you that God was not punishing you, but preparing you, and that from here on, new steps will need to be taken with wisdom, courage, and faithfulness. In the next videos of this series, we will move forward with even greater clarity. We will talk about when separation stops being an option and becomes obedience. We will explore how to break repeating cycles. We will learn, in the light of the Bible and the writings of Ellen White, how to rebuild identity after abusive relationships and how to walk toward a healthy emotional and spiritual life. If this message has brought light to your heart, use the comments not as exposure, but as an act of awareness. Sometimes, writing a simple sentence is the first step of an inner commitment to truth. And if you want to walk this path of liberation to the end, stay with us in this series. Each video was designed as a step, not of judgment, but of restoration. And remember, God did not allow this experience to mark you with pain, but to lead you into maturity. What you survived did not disqualify you. On the contrary, it prepared you. And what begins with clarity always ends in freedom.